I had a request to do a video on this topic of COVID-19 and disability and what's known as long COVID, and I thought that would be a good idea because I've seen several people severely disabled due to COVID, more people who've had COVID and fully recovered, and I myself had COVID in February and March of 2023. And COVID disability is on Social Security's radar, although it's not yet in the listing of impairments. If you go to the Social Security Disability website, they have articles on disability due to COVID. And I'm going to put a link to a good article on the Social Security website in the description to this video below. Hello, I'm John Foster. I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams, and as usual, everything I say reflects my own opinions based on my own experience and study, and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. Now, I'm going to give some background at first. COVID-19 is the third COVID or coronavirus pandemic that the world has experienced. The first was SARS, or Sudden Acute Respiratory Syndrome, in 2002. And this went worldwide and struck Canada pretty severely, but for whatever reason didn't really strike the United States. I had an uncle who was an orthopedic surgeon in Toronto, Canada. He's since passed away. And he told me that 3 of the nurses in his hospital died of SARS in 2002. The second coronavirus pandemic is MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which has been going on from 2012 to 2020, mostly in the Middle East. Didn't really go worldwide. And then the third, of course, is COVID-19, which appears to have started sometime around October to November 2019 in China. Now, there's been an enormous amount written about COVID-19 in blogs, in videos, in newscasts, and there's been a tremendous amount of anxiety and some real hysteria. And the only event in my career, and I've started my 48th year practicing medicine now, that can compare is the hubbub around HIV/AIDS, which took hold in the United States in 1976. And since I began my medical training in 1974, I've seen the whole AIDS pandemic play out from the very beginning to where we are now in 2024 in North America. Now, something to know is whenever you have an epidemic of disease like this that is associated with a great deal of anxiety and even some hysteria, it will trigger some people, and you will get some people who actually have the disease and some people who believe they have the disease but don't, and some people who have permanent effects from having had the disease, and some people who believe they have permanent effects from having had the disease, but really they don't. They are functional problems, or what we might call hypochondrical or hysterical problems. And I've seen this play out in COVID-19, and I'm going to describe some of the manifestations of actual physical problems brought on by COVID-19 and actual physical symptoms which appear to be primarily due to mental upset or worry or depression. And this is likely going to trigger some viewers, but I believe in telling the truth as best I know it, so I'm going to plow ahead. Finally, once again, I need to state that I don't run Social Security and I don't make Social Security disabilities rules. I simply pass on what information I can glean about them to the viewers of this video. And if you find that you object to some of the rules, getting angry at me in the comments will achieve absolutely nothing. If you really think a rule needs to be changed, I suggest that you write to the Social Security Administration, and I'll include the address where you can direct your letter in the description to this video below. Now, whenever you have people who believe that they're sick but actually are not and persist in that belief, one of the interesting things is that they will always complain of problems that cannot be demonstrated objectively, that can't be seen on physical examination or by doing tests such as blood or urine tests, or imaging studies such as X-rays or MRIs, or pathological studies where a sample of the person's body tissue is examined in the path lab, usually under a microscope. And common problems that people will complain of are headaches, dizziness, fatigue, dizzy spells, nausea. If somebody complains of a broken bone, when they don't really have a broken bone, you can get an X-ray, and in 15 seconds looking at the X-ray, you can tell the bone isn't broken. Likewise, if somebody believes that they have asthma when really they don't, you can listen to their chest with a stethoscope and in 15 seconds know if they have asthma or not, because asthma produces very characteristic abnormal sounds in the lungs that you hear with a stethoscope. However, you cannot prove that somebody's having a headache or not, or that someone is nauseated or not. 2 days ago on the internet, I read an article saying that a range of health problems, including migraines, vertigo, and nausea, has stalked residents of Granbury, Texas. Could noise pollution from Bitcoin mining be responsible? And as soon as I read that, I knew that that was a clear example of mass hysteria. Now, two facets of long COVID that I've read about are obviously not due to physical problems. They're due to mental upset. The first is, I read that there's over 300 possible symptoms of long COVID, and that's obviously nonsense. There is no medical disease known to mankind that has over 300 symptoms. The second is a statement that the severity of the COVID infection and the severity of long COVID bear no relationship to each other. In other words, you're just as likely to be disabled from long COVID if you had a very mild infection or even an asymptomatic infection where you didn't even know you were infected but laboratory tests showed it. Just as likely to be severely disabled as someone who had severe COVID and spent weeks in the intensive care unit, several of them on a ventilator. And again, that's absolute nonsense. Every single infectious disease that we've known of, from smallpox to polio to meningococcal meningitis, in every instance, if the person has persistent effects, it's related to how severe the initial infection was. Similarly, there's a lot of hysteria over so-called adverse reactions to the COVID vaccine. Now think about this. From what I could glean, at least 270 million Americans got at least one dose of vaccine. That's more than 2/3 of the entire population. Now, just by random chance, some of those people would develop medical problems shortly after getting the vaccine. But does the fact that a person got athlete's foot a week after getting the COVID vaccine mean that it was caused by the COVID vaccine? Well, it's possible, but that's no proof. Similarly, if someone dropped dead a week after getting the COVID vaccine, was that due to the COVID vaccine? Again, it's possible, but people drop dead every day in the United States, and it may simply be unrelated. If you really want to know if something is due to an infection or a vaccine, you have to study a large number of people, some of whom got infected and some of whom didn't, or some of whom got the vaccine and some of whom did it. And then you have to match them for things like their age, their sex, their general physical health, their medical problems, what medications they take, etc., etc. So now I'm going to change gears and talk about persistent effects of COVID-19 infection that are genuine physical problems. And I divide them into two. The first are non-specific effects of having a severe infectious disease and having had severe pneumonia, because we know that COVID can be a very severe infectious disease and cause extremely severe and even in many cases fatal pneumonia. Anyone who has a severe prolonged infection is going to have weakness and fatigue in the recovery period, and that can last a long time, months to a year or more. Likewise, anyone who has a severe prolonged infection likely won't be feeling at the top of their game mentally when the acute infection is over. And in fact, anxiety and depression are common features in people who've recovered from a severe infectious disease. People who spend a long time in the hospital, immobilized in bed, tend to have a risk of developing blood clots. These blood clots usually develop in the legs, where they're called deep venous thrombosis, and these blood clots can break off, travel up the veins to the heart, and be pumped out into the lungs, where they are called pulmonary embolism, which can cause anything from mild to severe disease and even death. Any reason that puts a person in bed, especially if they're sick, for days or weeks is liable to cause that sort of problem. Anyone who spends a long time in the intensive care unit is likely to have problems with their memory and thinking in the recovery period. And very severe medical problems of any type that put a person in the intensive care unit for a prolonged period of time, weeks or months, can develop what's called multiple organ system failure, which is where one group of organs after another will fail. And if the person recovers, those organ systems may recover completely, or they may never completely recover, and there may be permanent problems. And common organ systems for this to develop in are the lungs, the kidneys, the heart, the gastrointestinal system, especially the liver, the nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, and the blood. So these are general problems that can arise from any severe infectious illness. In my personal experience, I was sick for 27 days with COVID. I didn't need to be in the hospital or the intensive care unit, but when I recovered, I found that I had lost about 25% of my physical fitness and it took 3 to 4 months for that to come back. And I've seen multiple patients who've had severe COVID with what appear to be permanent problems with their lungs and or their heart. And typically these people are short of breath, either at rest or with very minimal exertion, such as walking across the examination room. The other group of disabling problems from COVID are COVID-specific, problems that seem to be unique or much more common than with other infectious diseases. And the first of these is loss of smell, or what we call anosmia. I know a man who had COVID, wasn't hospitalized, but completely lost his sense of smell for 2.5 years. It eventually did come back. And during that 2.5-year period, he lost a significant amount of weight because food had no taste. It was like eating sawdust for him. Other specific problems related to COVID, the COVID seems to cause a type of heart inflammation called myocarditis, and it also seems to cause a risk of blood clots that's higher than just the risk of blood clots due to being immobilized or lying in bed alone. And these blood clots can cause problems such as strokes, heart attacks, and I've seen one person who had damage to his spinal cord, which again was permanent due to blood clotting. He was partially paralyzed from the waist down after recovering from a severe bout of COVID. Finally, I want to talk about what's called brain fog, problems with thinking and memory. And many people report this after COVID, and that can be a problem because I believe that some people really do have problems with thinking and memory after COVID. I've seen several people that I consider very reliable who told me of those sorts of problems, but also I've seen some people where I think it's mostly hysterical or hypochondriacal. For example, 2 weeks ago, I saw a person who gave me a very detailed medical history, including all of their operations, etc., and then told me, I can't remember anything. Well, that's obviously not true, but frequently I get similar people telling me that they have brain fog, and they appear to me to be thinking and remembering normally. Here are 2 common normal conditions that are often mistaken for problems with thinking and memory. The first is having difficulty remembering a particular word that you've known in the past. That's normal. It happens to everyone. The second is going into a room to get something, and when you enter the room, you forget what you entered the room to get. That's called change of frame amnesia, and again, is normal. It happens to everyone. Interestingly, I certainly have seen people with severe problems with thinking and memory for disability exams, and none of those people has ever told me that they had problems with their memory and cognition. Another thing to keep in mind is that it is possible to be approved for Social Security disability if you have problems with your thinking and memory, but generally those problems have to be severe. Always remember, Social Security only awards disability if you can't do a simple entry-level job, such as bagging groceries. Some people have jobs that require a very high level of mental acuity. For example, I've examined 2 lawyers for Social Security disability. Now, a lawyer who lost 10% of their ability to think and remember might no longer be able to function as a lawyer, but Social Security wouldn't consider them disabled because they'd be able to function at a simple entry-level job such as a janitor or bagging groceries. So, if you're disabled from COVID or are applying for disability based on the long-term effects of COVID, here's my advice. Number 1, remember that in order to qualify for Social Security disability, your problem has to be present for at least 12 months or be expected to be present for at least 12 months. In the vast majority of COVID cases, this means that you should wait until 12 months after your infection before applying. Second, does your medical records support your disability? Is there evidence of severe infection? Were you hospitalized? If you were hospitalized, were you in the intensive care unit? If you were in the intensive care unit, did you have to be on a ventilator? Does your medical record support evidence of persistent problems after getting over the acute COVID infection? And are there objective signs of disease, things that the doctor can see on their exam, or things that can be demonstrated by tests? If you're having trouble with breathing, helpful tests are first what's called pulmonary function tests, where you breathe into a machine and the machine measures your breathing capacity. And second, arterial blood gases, which is a blood sample that shows the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your blood. If you're having heart problems after COVID infection, useful tests are an electrocardiogram, which shows the electrical activity of the heart, and an echocardiogram, which is the machine that we use to show pictures of the baby in the womb, and in the case of the heart, shows pictures of the heart as it beats. If you've had problems with blood clots, the best test for showing blood clots in the legs is an ultrasound, and the best test for showing blood clots in the lungs, what we call pulmonary embolism, is a CT scan of the chest and or a lung scan. If you believe that you have brain fog, it can be very helpful if you have yourself evaluated by a clinical psychologist. Psychologists can do very detailed evaluations of a person's ability to remember and to think. And an interesting thing about psychologists is they're fairly tricky folks, and in almost all of their tests, they have trick questions designed to detect deception or pretending. If you don't have health care insurance or do not have the availability to get some of these tests, Social Security may order and pay for pulmonary function testing, arterial blood gas testing, and electrocardiogram. Social Security may also arrange for and pay for a psychological evaluation. Again, keep in mind that psychological evaluations are designed to detect real problems and to detect simulation of problems. I'll give you one example not related to COVID. Commonly, people who are arrested for murder will try to avoid punishment by claiming that they were insane at the time they committed the murder. And they'll often say that they were hearing voices in their head telling them to murder the person. And psychologists will say, do you always do what the voices tell you to? And of course, the murderer will say, yes, I always do whatever they tell me to, and they told me to kill this person, and I did. The fact is, insane people who hear voices, who are almost all suffering from schizophrenia, never, ever do everything the voices tell them to do. In fact, they often try very hard to resist doing what the voices are telling them to do. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.